In the spring of 1947, a 64-year-old man was carried to his execution site because his legs were too weak to carry him there on their own. He didn't walk to his death. He was dragged to it. The crowd that gathered didn't weep. They cursed at him. They screamed at him. And when the shots finally rang out, there was no silence of mourning, only the cold, hard exhale of a justice 9 years overdue. His name was Hisao Tani, and what he did in the city of Nanjing in the winter of 1937 stands as one of the most savage chapters in the entire history of modern warfare. This is the story of how a decorated Japanese general became a war criminal, and how, in the end, he paid the ultimate price. If you believe that history must be remembered, especially when it is painful, then you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now and join the Timeless Words community, where we bring forgotten stories of justice, power, and consequence back to life. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The Making of a Soldier. Long before Hisao Tani became a name synonymous with atrocity, he was simply a farmer's son from Okayama Prefecture, born on December 22, 1882, in rural Japan. Japan in the late 1800s was a nation in transformation, ancient traditions colliding violently with modern ambitions. The emperor was considered a living god. The military was the highest calling a man could pursue. And young Hisao Tani, hungry for status and purpose, chose that path. In 1903, at just 20 years old, he graduated from the prestigious Imperial Japanese Army Academy, placing 16th in his class. Not at the top, but close enough to matter. 1 year later, the Russo-Japanese War erupted, a brutal conflict fought over control of Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. Japan shocked the entire world by defeating Russia, a European empire, decisively and completely. International observers couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Japan had announced itself on the world stage as a true military power. The Russian Empire, humiliated and battered, would never fully recover. That defeat planted the seeds of domestic unrest that blossomed into the 1905 Russian Revolution. And Tani was there for it. He fought as a second lieutenant in the Guards 1st Infantry Battalion during that war. He survived. He advanced. In 1912, he graduated from the elite Army War College, an institution modeled after the Prussian War Academy, where German officers drilled Japanese officers in the art of warfare. The curriculum rewarded discipline and obedience over creativity and independent thought. 6 of the top-performing graduates each year were personally awarded a ceremonial sword by the emperor himself. Tani graduated 3rd in his class. He received that sword. From there, his rise was steady and calculated. He was posted to Great Britain as a military attaché. He was embedded on the Western Front during World War I as an official observer, watching the carnage of modern warfare unfold in the trenches of Europe. He returned to Japan and taught at the Army Staff College. He even authored a required textbook, The Secret History of the Russo-Japanese War, drawing from his own first-hand combat experience. By August 1930, he was a major general. By August 1934, he was a lieutenant general. He was decorated. He was respected. He was one of the most senior military minds in the Imperial Japanese Army. And then, the orders came. Part 2. The Road to Nanjing. To understand what happened in Nanjing, you first need to understand the larger war taking shape across Asia. Japan had been eyeing China's resources for decades. On September 18, 1931, it made its move, invading Manchuria in northeastern China, a region rich in coal and minerals that Japan desperately needed to fuel its growing industrial war machine. The international community watched, protested, did nothing. Emboldened, Japan continued pushing. Skirmishes and incidents between Japanese and Chinese forces flared and subsided repeatedly throughout the early 1930s. But the real explosion came on the night of July 7, 1937, at a bridge outside Beijing. A small Japanese unit demanded entry into a Chinese-controlled town to search for a missing soldier. The Chinese garrison refused. A shot rang out, and within days, the Second Sino-Japanese War had begun in full. Both sides escalated. Both sides committed. And Japan, with one of the most powerful and disciplined armies in the world, began carving through China like a blade through silk. Beijing fell. Shanghai fell, after fierce resistance that cost both sides enormously. And then the Japanese military turned its eyes toward Nanjing, China's capital. By July 1937, Tani was commanding the 6th Division, which tore through the Battle of Beiping-Tianjin and then pivoted south. By October, his division was subordinated to the 10th Army and struck at Chinese troop concentrations at Hangzhou Bay. By December, his division was approaching the walls of Nanjing, and history was about to be made in the worst possible way. Part 3. The Fall of Nanjing. The Japanese military reached the outskirts of Nanjing on December 9, 1937. Three-quarters of the civilian population had already fled. The stories of what the Japanese army did to the towns and cities it captured had traveled ahead of the soldiers themselves. Wealthy families left first, in automobiles, with their valuables. The middle class followed. Then the poor. Only those with nowhere left to go remained: the destitute, the elderly, the sick, the desperate. At noon on December 9th, Japanese aircraft dropped leaflets over the city. The message was simple and chilling: surrender within 24 hours, or receive no mercy. No response came. General Iwan Matsui waited one additional hour past the deadline. Then he gave the order: take Nanjing by force. Under a storm of artillery fire and aerial bombardment, the city cracked on December 12th. General Sheng-chi, who had publicly vowed to defend Nanjing to the last man, ordered his troops to retreat. The result was catastrophic disorder. Soldiers stripped civilians of their clothing to disguise themselves. Men were shot by their own supervisory units as they tried to flee the city walls. On December 13, 1937, Hisao Tani's 6th Division, alongside the 116th Division, became the first Japanese forces to enter Nanjing. What followed is almost impossible to put into words. Part 4. The Massacre. Within hours of entering the city, Japanese soldiers began hunting down suspected Chinese soldiers hiding among the civilian population. Thousands of young men were swept up, many of them completely innocent, and arrested, marched to the banks of the Yangtze River, and machine-gunned to death in mass executions. Others were killed with landmines, then soaked in petrol and burned alive. Survivors of the initial blasts were finished with bayonets. Prisoners of war were beheaded. And families, entire families, who had been hiding in their homes were dragged into the streets. The violence was not random. It was organized. It was methodical. It was relentless. But the killings were only part of what made Nanjing an event that has haunted generations. Japanese soldiers also committed mass sexual violence on a scale that defies comprehension. Estimates of the number of women assaulted range from 20,000 to 80,000. Soldiers went door to door, systematically searching homes for women and girls. Victims ranged in age from young children to the elderly. Hisao Tani, a 54-year-old lieutenant general, a decorated military officer, a man who had received a ceremonial sword from the emperor, was not above this. He was, in fact, directly implicated in these crimes by multiple eyewitnesses. He personally committed acts of sexual violence against women in multiple locations across Nanjing. He was not some low-ranking soldier acting on impulse in the chaos of war. He was the commanding general. And he participated anyway. The violence lasted weeks. 1/3 of the city was burned to the ground through deliberate arson. As many as 300,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers lost their lives over 2 months of unrelenting brutality. The fires, the chaos, and the mass graves made a precise accounting impossible, but no serious historian disputes the scale. A former Japanese soldier, Shiro Izuma, later spoke candidly about what happened in Nanjing. His words, delivered years later, remain among the most disturbing confessions ever recorded about the massacre, a quiet, matter-of-fact acknowledgement that the killing was intentional, systematic, and deliberate. The violence in Nanjing finally subsided in February 1938, after a Japanese-backed Chinese puppet government was established to maintain the appearance of order. Tani returned to Japan at the end of 1937. He commanded the Central District Army. In September 1939, he quietly retired into the reserves. He thought it was over. He was wrong. Part 5. Justice. On September 2, 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally, ending World War II. 6 months later, in February 1946, Hisao Tani was arrested by order of American occupation authorities. At the formal request of the Chinese government, he was extradited to China to stand trial before the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal. Tani walked into that courtroom defiant. He denied everything. He claimed his troops maintained discipline. He insisted the area under his command had been largely empty due to the intensity of the battle. When prosecutors placed photographs of massacred civilians in front of him, piles of bodies, mass graves, evidence that could not be fabricated, Tani looked at the images and said, coldly, that no one could prove those people were killed by his soldiers. He deflected. He minimized. He hid behind the language of military orders and chain of command. The court was not moved. On March 10, 1947, the Nanjing Military Court delivered its verdict. The ruling stated plainly that after the capture of Nanjing, Tani had overseen and participated in massacres of prisoners and non-combatants, sexual violence, looting, and the wholesale destruction of property. The victims numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The methods, beheading, burning alive, gang assault, were, in the court's own words, unparalleled in severity. The sentence, death. Tani appealed 3 times, March 18th, April 24th, and April 25th. Each appeal was rejected without hesitation. The execution. On April 26, 1947, Hisao Tani was escorted to his execution site at Mount Yuhuatai. He could not walk there under his own power. The man who had commanded tens of thousands of soldiers, who had received a sword from the emperor, who had arrogantly denied his crimes before a war crimes tribunal, that man had to be physically held up by 2 gendarmes just to remain standing. He was 64 years old. The execution was held publicly. Chinese civilians gathered to witness it. Eyewitnesses reported that Tani looked visibly terrified, his body trembling, his face a mask of fear. The crowd surrounding him did not offer sympathy. They cursed him. They named what he had done. They refused to let him leave this world in silence. When the shots were fired, there was no mourning. No tears were shed for Hisao Tani. The Nanjing Massacre lasted roughly 6 weeks. The consequences of it, the grief, the trauma, the diplomatic tension between China and Japan, have lasted nearly 9 decades and continue to this day. Japan's official acknowledgement of what happened in Nanjing remains a source of profound historical dispute and international tension. But in the spring of 1947, in a courtyard at Mount Yuhuatai, justice, imperfect, delayed, but real, was delivered. Hisao Tani did not escape history. And history will not forget Nanjing. If this story moved you, if you believe that the victims of history deserve to be remembered and that the perpetrators must be named, then please subscribe to Timeless Words right now. Leave a comment below telling us what you think justice looked like in this case. Share this video with someone who needs to know this history. And click the notification bell so you never miss another episode. We bring the forgotten stories back to life, because the past always has something left to say. See you in the next one.